99%. Think about that number for a second. Over 99% of all species that have ever existed on this planet are now extinct, gone forever. Our world is built on the ghosts of 1 billion failed experiments. But what if I told you about a time when extinction itself almost became obsolete, because there was almost nothing left for it to kill? An event so devastating it came terrifyingly close to sterilizing the entire planet, hitting the reset switch on life itself. This is the story of the Great Dying, the day the Earth's heart almost stopped beating. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. The stories of our planet are the greatest epics ever told. So, subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments, and it's like having breakfast with someone in London while someone else in California is just heading to bed. It's a reminder that we all share this one tiny rock floating through the dark. Now, before you get lost in a world that existed 252 million years ago, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss what happens next. Picture this. You are standing on the shore of a vast, silent ocean. The air is thick, heavy, and carries more oxygen than you're used to, making you feel strangely alert. The sun in the sky is the same, but the world it illuminates is alien. There are no birds, no flowers. The plants on the coast are like nothing you've ever seen. Towering, tree-sized ferns and strange, cone-bearing trees that seem to hum with ancient life. This is Earth during the Permian period, and right now, life is booming. For millions of years, evolution has been on a creative frenzy, crafting a world that is stable, successful, and teeming with creatures stranger than any fiction. All the land on Earth is fused into one colossal supercontinent. We call it Pangaea. It's not just a collection of continents, it's the planet's single beating heart, a landmass so enormous it creates its own brutal climate patterns. In the interior, there are deserts larger than anything that exists today, baked under an unforgiving sun. But along the coasts and river systems, life flourishes in a way that is almost unimaginable. This isn't the age of dinosaurs, not yet. This is a different, older, and in some ways more monstrous world. This is the age of the synapsids. Now, you might look at the most famous creature from this time, the sail-backed Dimetrodon, and think you're looking at a dinosaur, but you're not. You're looking at something far more significant. You're looking at an animal that is more closely related to you than to any T-Rex. These were the first great dynasty to rule the Earth. They weren't quite reptiles, and they weren't quite mammals. They were a third thing entirely, evolution's first draft of us. And they had perfected the art of survival. For tens of millions of years, they were the undisputed masters of this world. Herbivores the size of rhinos, covered in thick, leathery skin, browsed on tough ferns. Smaller, quicker creatures hunted in the dense undergrowth. And at the very top of this brutal food chain, there was a predator that would give even a Tyrannosaurus pause. Imagine a wolf crossed with a saber-toothed tiger but built like a bear. This was the Gorgonopsian, a synapsid killing machine. They were the apex predators of the Permian, armed with huge dagger-like canine teeth and a powerful, efficient stride that let them run down almost any prey. Their fossils show they were built for one thing: absolute dominance. For millions of years, the Gorgonopsians and their kin were the kings. Their world was a perfectly balanced system of predator and prey, a dance of life and death that had been choreographed over an immense stretch of time. The land belonged to them, but the real show was in the oceans. The seas of the Permian were a global aquarium, a riot of evolutionary experimentation. Trilobites, those armored, insect-like creatures that had dominated the seas for 270 million years, were in their final act, but they were still there. Vast, intricate reefs, larger than Australia's Great Barrier Reef, stretched across the shallow coastal waters. But these reefs weren't made of the corals we know today. They were built by strange vase-like sponges and other bizarre filter-feeding organisms, creating underwater cities for thousands of species. Giant sea scorpions, some as long as a man, stalked the seabed. Strange sharks with anvil-shaped fins patrolled the waters. And the dominant life form, the most common visible animal in the seas, was the brachiopod. They looked like clams, but they were an entirely different kind of creature, and they covered the seafloor in dense colonies of billions. Life had figured it all out. On land, you had a stable, thriving ecosystem ruled by powerful, warm-blooded proto-mammals. In the sea, you had a complex, interconnected web of life that had been stable for longer than humans have existed. Everything worked. The climate was predictable. The seasons were regular. Life was in a state of perfect, brutal equilibrium. So what could possibly go wrong? That's the terrifying part. Nothing seemed wrong. If you were a creature living in the late Permian, you would have no reason to think your world was anything but eternal. Your ancestors had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and countless smaller extinction events. The rules of survival had been written in stone for eons. But this world, this perfectly functioning, incredibly successful world, was a dead world walking. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the mightiest Gorgonopsian, was living on borrowed time. Because halfway across the supercontinent, deep beneath the ground in what we now call Siberia, a geological monster was stirring. A force so immense it would tear the planet apart, poison the oceans, and choke the sky. They were the undisputed masters of the world, with no rivals and no challengers. But they were living on a time bomb, and the fuse had just been lit. To truly understand what was lost in the Great Dying, you have to understand who ruled the world that was about to burn. You have to look the apex predators of the Permian right in the eye. Forget the dinosaurs. They were a replacement, a dynasty that rose from the ashes of a far older and arguably more successful kingdom. For nearly 50 million years, the top of the food chain didn't belong to reptiles. It belonged to our own distant, monstrous relatives, the Therapsids, and their kings were the Gorgonopsians. The name itself sounds like something from a nightmare. Gorgon face. It was given to them by the first paleontologists who unearthed their skulls and were so struck by their ferocious appearance they named them after the mythical Greek monsters. The name fits. Picture this. You are crouched in a thicket of giant Permian ferns. The air is damp and smells of soil and decay. You hear a sound, not a roar but a heavy, rhythmic panting like a giant bellows. A shadow falls over you and you look up. Staring down at you is a creature the size of a grizzly bear, but leaner, faster, and built for a single purpose: to kill. Its head is massive, a solid block of bone and muscle, but it's the teeth that paralyze you. Two enormous, saber-like canines, each a foot long, jut down from its upper jaw. They are not for chewing. They are for puncturing, for slicing through hide and flesh in a single devastating bite. This is Inostrancevia, one of the largest Gorgonopsians, and you are its prey. What made these animals so terrifyingly effective wasn't just their size or their teeth, it was their design. They were a perfect fusion of reptilian and mammalian traits, taking the best of both worlds. Unlike the sprawling lizards of their time, their legs were positioned directly underneath their bodies. This is a huge deal. It meant they could move with a powerful, efficient, mammal-like gait. They weren't lumbering. They were pursuing. They could run, chase, and outmaneuver their prey over long distances. They were endurance hunters in a world of sprinters. This single evolutionary advantage put them leagues above everything else on land. They were the wolves at the door of every other creature on the planet, and their senses were sharpening. Their skulls show large openings for powerful jaw muscles, but also growing evidence of specialized senses. Large eye sockets suggest keen vision. The structure of their inner ear was becoming more sophisticated. And unlike reptiles who would swallow their prey whole, the Gorgonopsians had a specialized set of teeth. They had incisors at the front for gripping, those massive canines for killing, and smaller post-canine teeth for slicing off chunks of meat. This is the beginning of the mammalian blueprint. They were processing their food, a behavior that allows for a faster metabolism, a more active lifestyle. They weren't cold-blooded, sluggish killers waiting for the sun to warm them. They were energetic, warm-blooded stalkers that generated their own heat. They were the engines of the Permian world, and their fuel was flesh. Now, you might think of them as mindless brutes, but their success tells a different story. To hunt effectively in a complex environment requires intelligence. Paleontologists believe they likely hunted in packs, or at least small family groups, much like modern wolves. Imagine a pack of these saber-toothed nightmares working together, coordinating an attack on a herd of Scutosaurus, massive tank-like herbivores covered in bony armor plates. It would have been a battle of titans, a strategic, brutal chess match played out in the fern-choked floodplains of Pangaea. The Gorgonopsians weren't just killing, they were solving problems. They were the reigning intellects of their time, and they weren't alone at the top. The Permian was a gallery of evolutionary marvels. The herbivores they hunted weren't just lumbering sacks of meat, they were fortresses. You had creatures like the Scutosaurus, an animal the size of a hippo but built like a walking castle. Its name means shield lizard, and for good reason. Its body was covered in thick, bony plates, a natural coat of mail. Then there were the moss-chops, bizarre-looking herbivores with massively thick skulls, up to 4 inches of solid bone, likely used in brutal head-butting contests for dominance. And perhaps strangest of all was the Astemonosuchus, a large hippo-like herbivore with a crown of bizarre horns growing from its skull, hinting at complex social behaviors. This was a world of specialists. Every niche was filled. Every creature was locked in a multi-generational arms race with every other creature. The plants evolved tougher leaves, so the herbivores evolved stronger jaws. The herbivores evolved armor, so the predators evolved more powerful ways to kill them. It was a finely tuned machine that had been running, improving, and perfecting itself for tens of millions of years. And the Gorgonopsians were the master engineers, the apex force that kept the entire system in balance. They culled the weak, they kept herbivore populations in check, and their presence drove the evolution of everything around them. For 50 million years, if you were an animal on land, your life was defined by one simple fact. A Gorgonopsian could be watching you. Their dominance was total. Their reign seemed absolute. They were the pinnacle of creation, evolution's greatest success story to that point. They had conquered every continent because every continent was one. They had adapted, thrived, and perfected the art of being at the top. You have to understand this. You have to feel the sheer, unshakable permanence of their world. These were not fragile creatures clinging to existence. They were the kings, the tyrants, the gods of their age. And like all gods, they probably thought their reign would last forever. But their perfect world, their balanced kingdom built on strength and teeth and 50 million years of success, was about to become their tomb. The greatest predator on Earth was about to be hunted by the Earth itself. For millions of years, the Permian world ran like a perfectly calibrated clock. The seasons turned, the rains fell, and the great dance of predator and prey continued under a stable, predictable sun. The Gorgonopsians were the undisputed kings. The system was working, and life, in all its brutal glory, was good. But the deadliest threats are the ones you can't see. The ones that build in silence, deep in the dark. While the rulers of the Permian were busy hunting, a sickness was spreading through the veins of the planet itself. A geological cancer was metastasizing deep within the Earth's crust, and it was about to break through the surface. The villain of our story doesn't have teeth or claws. It has a simple, almost boring name: the Siberian traps. But this is, without exaggeration, the most horrifying feature on the face of the planet. Today, it's a vast, desolate region in the heart of Siberia, a landscape of stepped, rocky hills stretching over an area larger than Western Europe. But 252 million years ago, it was something else entirely. It was a wound, a gargantuan open wound in the planet's crust that bled fire for 1 million years straight. This wasn't a volcano. You have to understand that. A volcano is a mountain that erupts. This was the Earth itself cracking open. Geologists call it a flood basalt event. That's a clinical term for a planetary catastrophe. It's what happens when a massive plume of superheated mantle from deep within the Earth punches its way to the surface, not through a single vent, but through a vast network of fissures stretching for hundreds of miles. It's not an eruption. It's a deluge. A flood of lava so immense it buries entire landscapes, creating a new surface for the world made of black volcanic rock. And for thousands of years before the main event, this monster began to stir. It started sending out whispers of the horror to come. Picture this: you're a massive, armored Scutosaurus grazing in a fern prairie thousands of miles from Siberia. One day, the rain that falls from the sky feels different. It stings. It leaves a faint, acrid smell on the leaves. This was the first warning sign. The early, smaller eruptions from the Siberian traps were pumping enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. This gas mixed with water to create sulfuric acid rain. At first, it wasn't strong enough to kill the forests, but it was strong enough to sicken them. The great fern trees began to show signs of stress, their leaves yellowing at the edges. The delicate soil chemistry began to change. For the amphibians, the creatures that lived their lives between water and land, this was a direct assault. Their sensitive, porous skin was their weakness. Rivers and lakes that had been their nurseries for generations started to become subtly more acidic. Their eggs laid in the shallow water began to fail. Populations that had been stable for millions of years started to shrink. It was a silent plague, a mystery killer that left no marks but death. The animals of the Permian had no way of knowing their world was being poisoned from 10,000 miles away. They only knew that the water was becoming sour and the world was becoming sick. At the same time, another invisible poison was seeping into the oceans: carbon dioxide. The early eruptions were also belching out billions of tons of CO2. This gas, just like today, was being absorbed by the oceans. And as it dissolved, it began to change the water's fundamental chemistry. The seas started to acidify. For the countless creatures that built their homes from calcium carbonate, the reef builders, the brachiopods, the ammonites, this was a declaration of war. Their shells, the very armor that had protected their ancestors for hundreds of millions of years, became harder to build. Their skeletons grew thinner, more fragile. The great reefs, those bustling underwater metropolises, began to weaken. They weren't dying yet, not all at once, but they were under siege from an enemy they couldn't see. The very water that gave them life was now slowly, relentlessly trying to dissolve them. But how can a series of eruptions in one corner of the world poison an entire planet? It seems impossible, right? The answer is in the sky. The Earth's atmosphere is not a collection of separate regional air pockets. It is a single global engine. Gases and particles blasted into the stratosphere over Siberia don't stay over Siberia. They are caught by the jet streams and distributed around the entire globe within weeks. The poison from that one great wound in the Earth's crust was being systematically delivered to every ecosystem on the planet. No creature was safe. There was nowhere to hide. Alongside the acid, the planet was also beginning to run a fever. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat. As more and more of it poured into the atmosphere, the Earth's thermostat began to creep upwards. The change was slow, almost imperceptible at first. A degree warmer here, a few degrees there. Winters became a little milder. The ice caps at the poles began to shrink just a tiny bit faster. For the animals on the ground, these early stages of global warming might have even seemed pleasant. But it was a trap. The entire climate system, which had been in a delicate balance for millions of years, was being pushed towards a tipping point. And the thing about tipping points is you don't know you've crossed one until it's far too late to go back. The kings of the world, the Gorgonopsians, carried on as if nothing was wrong. They were still the fastest, strongest predators. They could still run down a fleeing herbivore with terrifying efficiency. Their world was still full of prey. They were too successful, too dominant to notice the subtle changes happening at the edges of their existence. They were like a billionaire on the deck of the Titanic, completely unaware that the ship had already struck the iceberg miles below the surface. Life continued its ancient rhythms, but the planet itself was becoming unstable. The foundations of their world were quietly rotting away, and the architects of that world, the apex predators, were blissfully ignorant. We know this today because the evidence is written in the rocks. Geologists can drill into the stone layers of the Siberian traps and see the history of the eruptions, layer by layer of black lava. Paleontologists can examine fossils from the end of the Permian period from all over the world, from South Africa to China, and see the signs of stress. They can analyze the chemical isotopes in the rock and see the exact moment when the carbon cycle of the planet went haywire. It's a global crime scene, and the clues all point to one culprit. The Earth had been sending out warning signs for thousands of years, but the planet's inhabitants had no way to read them. The whispers of its coming fever, the silent tremors of its sickness were about to turn into a full-throated scream. The planet wasn't just sick anymore. It was about to become the killer. The silent warnings were over. The planet's subtle fever, the souring of its oceans, the sickness in its forests. These were the tremors before the earthquake, the quiet inhale before the deafening scream. For thousands of years, the monster beneath Siberia had been stirring. Now it was about to awaken, and when it did, it would unleash a vision of hell so complete it would forever be known as the beginning of the Great Dying. Picture this: the ground beneath you, which has been solid for your entire life, for all of your ancestors' lives, is no longer solid. It begins to groan, a deep resonant sound that you feel in your bones more than you hear with your ears. It is the sound of a continent being torn in half. Then, with a cataclysmic roar that dwarfs thunder, the earth splits open. This is not a mountain peak exploding. This is the ground itself, the flat, stable Siberian plains ripping apart. A fissure, a crack in the world appears on the horizon, and then another and another, vast, glowing red cracks, hundreds of miles long, tearing through the landscape as if the planet were a piece of paper, and from these wounds fire erupts. Not a plume of ash from a single point, but a continuous curtain of liquid rock, fountaining hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet into the air along the entire length of these fissures. It is a wall of fire that stretches from one end of the horizon to the other. The sky, moments ago a hazy Permian blue, turns into a roiling ceiling of black and orange. The sun vanishes, blotted out by a cloud of ash so thick it turns day into a terrifying torchlit night. The air, once rich with oxygen, becomes a choking cocktail of sulfur dioxide and other volcanic gases. The sound is no longer a series of explosions, but a single continuous world-shaking roar. The sound of a planet screaming. This is the main eruptive phase of the Siberian traps. And it is a scene of utter, unimaginable devastation. The sheer volume of lava that poured out is difficult for the human mind to grasp. Over the course of the eruptions, which continued in pulses for up to 1 million years, more than 3 million cubic kilometers of basalt flooded the land. Let's try to put that number in perspective. That is enough lava to bury the entire continental United States half a mile deep. It is enough to cover the entire surface of the moon in a layer 10 feet thick. This wasn't a lava flow, this was a lava ocean, a new molten surface being poured onto the earth, burying everything that had existed before. Forests of giant ferns that had stood for millennia were vaporized in an instant. Rivers that had carved their paths for ages boiled away, their water turning to steam before the lava even reached them. The entire landscape was being erased, reset to zero under a sea of black rock. For any life caught in this immediate zone, there was no struggle. There was no survival. There was only annihilation. Imagine being the apex predator, a great Gorgonopsian, the king of this world. Your entire life has been spent at the top of the food chain, fearing nothing. Your senses are honed to detect the slightest movement of prey, but no evolutionary advantage could prepare you for this. The very ground you stand on becomes your enemy. The air you breathe becomes poison. The sky itself becomes a rain of fire and suffocating ash. You are the ultimate predator, but you are being hunted by the ground beneath you. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. In the heart of Pangaea, an area the size of modern Europe was simply sterilized, wiped clean from the face of the planet. But the real horror, the thing that elevated this from a massive regional disaster to a global extinction event, was a terrible geological coincidence. The mantle plume that fueled the Siberian traps didn't just punch through any old crust, it erupted directly beneath and through the middle of the Tunguska Basin, one of the largest deposits of coal, oil and gas on the entire planet. The lava, at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, didn't just flow over the ground, it ignited the coal seams from below. It set the entire basin on fire. This is the detail that changes everything. The planet didn't just open a wound of lava, it threw the world's largest fossil fuel reserve onto a planetary-sized bonfire. It was a geological disaster and an industrial disaster combined, 252 million years before the Industrial Revolution. The burning coal released biblical quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and toxic heavy metals into the atmosphere, massively amplifying the destructive power of the eruption itself. The ash that fell wasn't just pulverized rock anymore, it was laced with mercury and other poisons. The CO2 being pumped into the sky wasn't just coming from the volcano, it was coming from a million years of ancient sunlight stored in the form of coal, now being released all at once. This is the moment the planet's climate system breaks. The delicate balance of gases that had kept the Earth in a stable, life-sustaining state for millions of years was shattered. The initial blast of sulfur dioxide created acid rain and some temporary cooling, but that was just the opening act. The main event was the colossal, unending injection of greenhouse gases from both the volcano and the burning coal fields. The Earth's thermostat was no longer just creeping up, it was being violently broken off the wall. The planet was now locked on a one-way path to a catastrophic hothouse state. For the creatures living in the heartland of Pangaea, the world had ended in a storm of fire, ash, and rock. Their story was over, but for the rest of the life on Earth, for the brachiopods in the ocean, for the amphibians in the wetlands, for the other synapsid dynasties living thousands of miles away, the killer was still on its way. A toxic, superheated cloud larger than a continent was churning and growing in the stratosphere, and the great engine of the atmosphere, the jet streams, were beginning to carry it to every last corner of the Earth. Hell had opened its gates in Siberia, but its demons were about to be delivered worldwide. The fires raging in Siberia were a local hell, a continental sacrifice zone. But the true killer wasn't the lava, it was the smoke. For hundreds of thousands of years, that great wound in the earth pumped the toxic breath of the planet's interior directly into the sky. A colossal plume of carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur, and chlorine, enriched by the burning of 1 billion tons of ancient coal, rose into the stratosphere. And then the jet streams, the great rivers of the sky, took hold of it. They began to circulate this poison systematically, relentlessly, to every corner of the globe. The disaster was no longer regional, it had gone airborne. The entire world was now under attack. The first weapon the planet unleashed upon itself was heat. The sheer volume of CO2 and methane pouring into the atmosphere was unlike anything the Earth had experienced in hundreds of millions of years. These gases created a suffocating thermal blanket around the planet. You have to understand how this works. It's simple and it's terrifying. The atmosphere became a one-way street for energy. Sunlight could still get in, but the heat radiating back from the surface couldn't get out. The Earth was now trapping its own heat, and the temperature began to rise and rise and rise. The global fever that had started as a whisper was now a raging, delirious inferno. Global average temperatures may have soared by 10 degrees Celsius or more. That may not sound like much, but it's the difference between a pleasant summer day and a lethal heatwave. The world's climate zones were thrown into chaos. The lush tropical bands around the equator, once cradles of biodiversity, became furnaces. The temperate zones, where most life thrived, dried up, the soil cracking under a relentless sun. Vast continent-sized deserts began to expand, swallowing up the fern prairies and sparse woodlands. The great ice sheets at the poles, which had been stable for ages, began to melt at an unprecedented rate. The world was being cooked. The second weapon was the rain. The sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, now globally distributed, continued to create acid rain. But this wasn't the mild, tree-stressing rain from the early warnings. This was a deluge of acid, falling on every continent for centuries. Imagine a rain so corrosive it strips the leaves from the trees, leaving behind skeletal ghost forests. A rain that makes the soil so acidic that no new seedlings can grow. It turned the very thing that gives life, water from the sky, into a chemical weapon. Freshwater ecosystems, the lakes and rivers, were hit the hardest. They became toxic soups. Fish died in droves, their gills burned by the acidity, and the amphibians, the great survivors of the Permian who had managed to find refuge from the early acid attacks, now had nowhere left to go. Their world was being dissolved around them, so life could just hide, right? Move underground or find shelter in the deepest parts of the remaining forests. The problem is, the planet was now fighting a war on a third front, and this attack was even more insidious, coming from the sun itself. The massive volcanic explosions didn't just pump greenhouse gases into the sky, they also blasted ozone-destroying chemicals, like halogens from the ignited coal seams, high into the stratosphere. This cocktail of chemicals began to shred the Earth's ozone layer, the planet's shield, the delicate atmospheric layer that protects all life from the sun's most harmful ultraviolet radiation, was disintegrating. Picture this. The sun, already a dim, hazy ball behind the volcanic smog, is now a source of poison. The light that manages to get through is no longer just light. It is a blast of mutagenic, sterilizing radiation. For any animal that came out into the open, the UV radiation would have been devastating, causing blindness, cancers, and horrific skin damage. But the real victim was life at its most fundamental level. The radiation shredded the DNA of plants, causing mutations that crippled their ability to reproduce. Plankton in the surface waters of the ocean were obliterated. Life on Earth was being simultaneously cooked by the greenhouse effect, dissolved by acid rain, and now sterilized by poisonous sunlight. There was no escape. The very fundamentals of the environment, the air, the water, the light, had all become hostile to life. For the great synapsid rulers, this was an apocalypse they could not fight. A Gorgonopsian could kill any rival, but it couldn't kill the heat. It couldn't fight the acid that was destroying its food source. It couldn't hide from the sunlight that was burning its skin and eyes. Their entire world, the world they had been perfectly adapted to for 50 million years, had ceased to exist. Their strengths, their size, their warm-blooded metabolism that required huge amounts of food, now became their greatest weaknesses. The intricate food web that had supported their reign was unraveling from the bottom up. The plants died first, then the great armored herbivores who fed on them began to starve, and the Gorgonopsians, the kings at the top of the chain, were left to stalk a dying world surrounded by ghosts. We can read this story in the fossil record. Layer by layer, paleontologists can see the collapse. In rock layers from just before the extinction, you find a rich diversity of fossilized pollen from hundreds of plant species. In the layers just after, you find almost nothing but the fossilized spores of fungi. It's called the fungal spike, and it is the signature of a world of rot. It is the footprint of a planet where the forests have died on a global scale, and the only thing thriving is the fungus that is eating the dead and decaying wood. The land was dying, scorched by heat, dissolved by acid, and sterilized by radiation. Life on the surface was being pushed past the brink of survival. But the horrors on land were, believe it or not, just the prelude. The greatest killing field of the Permian extinction wasn't the continents, it was the oceans. The cradle of life on Earth was about to turn into a silent, suffocating, and almost entirely empty tomb. The war on the land was a battle of fire, acid, and radiation. It was a brutal, ugly slaughter that had turned the green heart of Pangaea into a barren, fungal wasteland. But the greatest dying in Earth's history wasn't happening on the surface. It was happening in the deep. The oceans, the vast, mysterious cradle from which all life had sprung, were about to become a global graveyard. The sickness of the land was now bleeding into the sea, and it was about to trigger an apocalypse that would make the horrors on the surface look like a prelude. The first blow to the oceans came from the relentless, oppressive heat. The runaway greenhouse effect that was cooking the continents was also baking the seas. The surface water of the oceans warmed dramatically, and this is where the killing began, with a simple law of physics. Hot water cannot hold as much dissolved gas as cold water. It's like a can of soda left out in the sun. It goes flat because all the carbonation, the gas, escapes. The oceans were going flat. They were losing their dissolved oxygen. They were, in the most literal sense, losing their ability to breathe. For the countless creatures that depended on that oxygen, from the smallest plankton to the largest sharks, every breath was becoming a little bit harder. The ocean's surface was becoming a thin, suffocating film. Then came the second blow, a direct consequence of the dying land. With the forests gone, stripped bare by acid rain and sterilized by UV radiation, there was nothing left to hold the soil. So when the toxic rains fell, they washed trillions of tons of dead, decaying organic matter, soil, and volcanic ash into the rivers, and from there directly into the sea. Today, we call this nutrient runoff, and it causes small, localized dead zones in our oceans. In the Permian, this happened on a global scale all at once. The oceans were being force-fed the corpses of the continents. This massive influx of nutrients triggered a monstrous planet-wide bloom of algae and bacteria in the surface waters. The seas would have turned into a thick green-brown soup. It was a fleeting, toxic feast, because when that colossal bloom of life died, it all sank into the depths. And down in the dark, the bacteria that decompose dead organic matter went to work. This process of decay consumes oxygen, and with a planet's worth of dead material sinking into the deep, the bacteria went into overdrive, consuming every last molecule of available oxygen from the seawater. The oceans began to stratify. Imagine a glass of oil and water. They don't mix. The Permian seas became like that. On top, a thin, hot, oxygen-poor layer of soupy water, and beneath it, a vast black and completely anoxic dead zone. The deep oceans, which make up over 90% of the living space on our planet, had become a suffocating void. For any creature that couldn't stay in that thin surface layer, and most couldn't, the world had just ended. But the true horror was yet to come. Because in a world without oxygen, a different kind of life takes over. Deep in the anoxic blackness, a new kingdom of bacteria began to thrive. These were not the bacteria of our world. They were ancient anaerobic life forms that see oxygen as a poison. They don't breathe oxygen, they breathe sulfate, and as they feasted on the endless rain of decaying matter from above, they began to exhale their own waste product, a gas, a poison of unimaginable toxicity, hydrogen sulfide. The bottom of the ocean became a planetary-scale septic tank, actively brewing a gas so deadly that a few breaths can kill a human. This hydrogen sulfide saturated the deep water, killing anything that had managed to survive the anoxia. And this gas did something else. It supported another, even more alien form of life, purple and green sulfur bacteria. These microbes thrived in the sunlit but anoxic surface waters, feeding on the rising hydrogen sulfide. Geologists believe the oceans of the late Permian would have been a horrifying, surreal sight. The surface a murky green soup, and just beneath it the water would have shifted into a ghastly alien purple, a purple ocean signaling a world of poison. You might think this sounds like science fiction, a poisonous purple ocean bubbling with deadly gas, but the geological evidence is undeniable. When scientists look at marine rock layers from this exact time, they find them full of pyrite, or fool's gold, a mineral that only forms in the presence of high levels of sulfur. They find chemical signatures, specific biological markers from those green and purple sulfur bacteria. The rocks tell the story of a seed that had turned septic. For thousands of years, this toxic brew was contained in the deep. But as the planet continued to heat up, the boundaries between the ocean layers began to break down. The hydrogen sulfide, produced in unimaginable quantities in the abyss, began to rise. It began to mix into the surface waters. And then, the Earth's final, most terrible weapon was unleashed. The super-poisonous ocean began to erupt. The hydrogen sulfide, having saturated the seas, began to bubble out of the water and into the atmosphere itself. Picture the shores of Pangaea. Any animal that had survived the heat and the acid, any creature that had found a last, desperate refuge on the coast, would now face a new, invisible killer. A toxic fog, smelling of rotten eggs, rolling in off the waves. The hydrogen sulfide gas was so poisonous it would have killed them in minutes, attacking their nervous systems and shutting down their bodies. And as this gas rose into the sky, it did one last thing. It attacked the remnants of the ozone layer, accelerating its destruction and letting in even more deadly UV radiation. The planet was now gassing its own survivors. This was the death blow. The trilobites, a creature so successful they had survived for 270 million years, through ice ages and asteroid impacts, finally met an enemy they could not overcome. They vanished, every last one of them. The great sea scorpions gone, the vast reefs built of sponges and brachiopods gone. Over 96% of all marine species were wiped from existence. The oceans became a silent, sterile, and stinking shadow of their former glory. The seas had become a chemical wasteland, a toxic memorial to a world that was gone. For the creatures still clinging to life on the scorched continents, the message from the purple, gasping ocean was clear. The source of all life had died. Now it was their turn. The oceans were dead. A purple, poisonous soup, exhaling a final gaseous sigh of hydrogen sulfide that rolled across the barren coasts, killing anything it touched. For the last creatures standing on the continents of Pangaea, this was the final, unmistakable message. The cradle of life was now a tomb. The war for survival on land, a war they had been losing for millennia, was about to enter its final, brutal stage. This was the peak of the great dying. This was life on Earth hitting rock bottom. Picture the world that the last Permian giants inherited. It is a world of ghosts. The vast continent-spanning fern forests are gone, replaced by skeletal leafless husks of trees, their trunks draped in a ghostly white shroud of fungus. There is no bird song, because birds do not exist yet. But more than that, there is no sound at all. The constant hum of insects that had been the background noise of the planet for 100 million years has fallen silent. This is the only mass extinction in Earth's history to have nearly wiped out the insects. Think about that. An event so toxic, so total, that it killed the unkillable. The silence of the Permian apocalypse would have been a profound, soul-crushing madness. The fern prairies, once filled with herds of armored herbivores, are now deserts of baked, cracked earth. The great rivers that once teemed with giant amphibians now run sluggish and black, choked with the silt of a dead world and the decaying sludge of its dead forests. The air itself is thin, poor in oxygen, and thick with the smell of volcanic haze and the faint rotten egg stench of hydrogen sulfide rolling in from the dead seas. It is a planet that looks and smells like it is rotting. In this dying world, the last of the kings are starving. Let's put you in their shoes. You are a Gorgonopsian, one of the last of your kind. For all your life, you have been the apex predator, the undisputed master of your domain. Your body is a finely tuned killing machine, the product of 50 million years of evolutionary dominance. Your saber teeth are the stuff of nightmares. Your powerful legs can outrun anything that lives, but now your strength is useless. Your teeth are a monument to a world that no longer exists. You are a king without a kingdom. You stalk through the fungal ghost forests, your senses on high alert, but there is nothing to hunt. The great herds of Scutosaurus and Moscops are gone. You find their remains half buried in the ash-caked soil, skeletons picked clean not by scavengers, but by bacteria and time. The complex society of the Permian has been reduced to a planet of refugees, and you are one of them. Your hunger is a constant physical pain. You are a warm-blooded creature, an engine that needs fuel, and your world has run out of gas. You are reduced to hunting anything that moves, small lizard-like creatures, the few insects that have managed to survive. You might even turn on your own kind in a final, desperate act of survival. But there is no escaping the math. The food chain has collapsed. The energy that once flowed from the sun to the plants to the herbivores and finally to you has been cut off at the source. The kings are starving to death in their crumbling castles, and they are not alone. Across the globe, every ecosystem is failing. We see it in the numbers. On land, over 70% of all vertebrate species were wiped from the face of the earth. It's not just individuals dying. It is entire branches of the tree of life being hacked off forever. Entire evolutionary lines, unique solutions to the problem of life that had been perfected over ages, were simply erased. The giant amphibians, the masters of the wetlands, gone. The bizarre horned herbivores, gone. The great sail-backed synapsids, gone. And with them the Gorgonopsians, the greatest predators the world had yet seen, vanished from the earth, leaving behind only their fossilized teeth to haunt the future. The definitive signature of this dead world is the fungal spike. When paleontologists dig through the rock layers of the Permian-Triassic boundary, they see it with shocking clarity. The layers below are rich with the fossilized pollen of a diverse, thriving plant world. Then, in the thin boundary layer that marks the extinction itself, all that pollen vanishes. And in the layers immediately above it, there is an explosion of one thing: the fossilized spores of fungus. For thousands of years, the most successful and dominant form of life on the continents was not a plant or an animal, it was mold. The planet had become a global compost pile, and the only thing thriving was the rot that was consuming the dead. In a world where everything is dying, is survival even a victory, or is it just a curse? To be the last Gorgonopsian, to be aware enough to know your world is gone, to be surrounded by the ghosts of your prey and the silence of your own extinction. It's a fate almost too bleak to imagine. This was the true horror of the great dying. It wasn't just death, it was the end of meaning, the end of a world that had worked for longer than we can comprehend. It was the universe hitting the delete button on a file named Permian. The heat, the acid, the radiation, the anoxia, the poison gas, It was a symphony of destruction, a perfect storm of killing mechanisms that life had no defense against. The Earth was now a tomb, scarred by fire, shrouded in a toxic haze, and haunted by a profound planetary silence. The great dynasties were dead. The kings were gone. The experiment of the synapsids, our own distant relatives, had failed in the most spectacular way possible. It was, for all intents and purposes, the end of the world. But the word almost is the most important word in the human story. Life was pushed to the absolute edge of annihilation, but it did not fall off. In the deepest, darkest corners of the dying world, in the rubble of the fallen kingdoms, a few strange, resilient creatures refused to let the story of life end. They were the forgotten, the overlooked, the humble, and they were about to inherit the earth. The world was a tomb. The air was poison, the seas were septic, and the land was a silent fungal wasteland haunted by the ghosts of its fallen kings. The great experiment of the synapsids, the 50-million-year reign of our own distant cousins, had ended in fire and suffocation. By every metric, by every law of biology and evolution, life should have failed. The great dying should have been the end of the story, but in the ruins of the apocalypse, something stirred. Beneath the scorched and sterilized soil, in burrows dug deep into the earth, a few unlikely creatures had ridden out the storm. They were not the strong, the fast, or the mighty. They were the humble, the overlooked, the survivors, and their story is the most improbable comeback in the history of the planet. Meet the hero of our story. Its name is Lystrosaurus, and it is, without a doubt, the strangest, most unassuming savior you could ever imagine. Picture a creature about the size of a pig. It has a short, stocky, barrel-chested body, and it walks with a clumsy, semi-sprawling gait. It doesn't have the saber teeth of a Gorgonopsian or the armor of a Scutosaurus. In fact, it has almost no teeth at all. Instead, it has a thick, turtle-like beak and two small tusks jutting down from its upper jaw. It is, to be blunt, profoundly weird. It looks like an animal designed by a committee that never spoke to each other. But every strange feature of this creature was a secret weapon, a key that would allow it to unlock a future on a planet where everything else was dying. Lystrosaurus had a set of superpowers perfectly suited for the end of the world. Its first and most important was its ability to dig. It was a master burrower. While the surface of the Earth was being baked by extreme heat, sterilized by UV radiation, and gassed by a toxic atmosphere, Lystrosaurus was safe underground. In its cool, dark tunnels, it could wait out the worst of the apocalypse. The heat waves, the acid rain, the poison air, none of it could touch it in its subterranean bunker. The very act of hiding, of getting out of the way, was the single most effective survival strategy on the planet, and Lystrosaurus had perfected it. Its second superpower was its diet.
That strange, beaked snout was not a design flaw. It was a tool of immense efficiency. It was perfect for cropping and slicing the toughest, most fibrous plants. While other herbivores, designed to eat the lush ferns of the Permian, were starving to death, Lystrosaurus could survive on the scraps. It ate the hardy, weedy plants that managed to survive the acid rain. It dug for nutritious roots and tubers that were protected underground.
It wasn't a picky eater. In a world where the global buffet had been reduced to a few scraps on the floor, being a dietary generalist was a ticket to survival. Its third superpower was in its lungs. That barrel-chested build housed a large and powerful respiratory system. Scientists believe it was exceptionally good at extracting oxygen from thin air. This was critical. In the oxygen-poor atmosphere of the post-extinction world, this was like having a built-in oxygen tank. And its presumed habit of living in crowded, stuffy burrows would have pre-adapted it for environments with low oxygen and high carbon dioxide. While other animals were literally gasping for breath, Lystrosaurus was breathing easy. This strange pig lizard wasn't the king of the Permian. It wasn't the CEO. It was the quiet, overlooked janitor of the ecosystem. The humble prepper who had been stocking its bunker for years while the masters of the universe were partying on the deck. And when the apocalypse came, the kings all died and the janitor inherited the earth. And inherit it did.
In the chaotic aftermath of the Great Dying, Lystrosaurus didn't just survive, it thrived. It exploded across the empty continents, taking advantage of a world suddenly devoid of predators and competitors. It became what paleontologists call a disaster taxon, a species that flourishes in the wake of a mass extinction. And its success was absolute. When we look at the fossil record from the early Triassic, the period immediately following the extinction, the numbers are staggering. In some regions, up to 95% of all land vertebrate fossils found are Lystrosaurus. Let that sink in. Imagine walking across an entire continent and seeing only one type of large animal, over and over and over again. Vast, continent-spanning herds of these pig turtles, moving across a desolate red-brown landscape, the undisputed masters of a broken world. But why them? What does it take to actually survive the end of the world? It's not what you think. It isn't strength.
The mighty Gorgonopsians were all dead. It isn't size. The colossal herbivores were all gone, and it isn't specialization. The masters of every niche had vanished. The secret to survival was being a generalist. It was being good enough at everything, but not perfectly adapted to anything. Lystrosaurus was the ultimate jack of all trades. It could dig, but not as well as a mole. It could walk, but not as well as a Gorgonopsian. It could eat plants, but its digestion wasn't as specialized as the great herbivores. But in a world where the rules were changing every day, that flexibility was everything. Of course, it wasn't just Lystrosaurus. In the shadows, other smaller creatures had also found a way to survive. Tiny lizard-like reptiles, many no bigger than a field mouse, had weathered the storm. These were the archosaurs, the ruling lizards, and their descendants would one day become the crocodiles, the pterosaurs, and the most famous dynasty of all, the dinosaurs. And hiding in burrows alongside Lystrosaurus, another group clung to life by a thread. The last of the synapsids, our own distant ancestors. They were no longer the mighty rulers of the world. They were small, nocturnal, probably insect-eating creatures living in the margins. They had survived by becoming small, by hiding and by waiting. They had lost the throne, but they had not lost the game. They had carried the mammalian lineage through the fire, ready for a chance that would not come for another 180 million years. The survivors of the Great Dying were a motley crew of misfits and outcasts. The creatures that had been living in the shadows of the Permian giants were now the only hope for the future. They had won the brutal lottery of survival. They had inherited the earth, but it was an inheritance of ash and silence, a broken planet under a hazy, sickly sun. They had won the game of survival, but now a new, even longer game was about to begin, the game of creation. How do you rebuild an entire biosphere from its own ruins? The survivors had inherited the earth, but it was a shattered inheritance, a world of ash and silence. For the creatures that made it through the fire, the apocalypse was over, but the struggle was not. They were the lonely inheritors of a planet that had been fundamentally broken. Winning the game of survival was one thing. Now they had to play a new, much longer game, the game of creation. How do you rebuild an entire biosphere from its own ruins? The answer is slowly, painfully, and over a timescale that is almost impossible for a human to comprehend. The world after the Great Dying was an empty, haunted place, and the evidence for this profound emptiness is written in what's missing from the geological record. For millions of years after the extinction, a period geologists call the early Triassic, something strange happens, or rather something stops happening. No coal is formed. anywhere on Earth. For about 10 million years, the coal swamps that had been a feature of the planet for ages simply vanish. It's called the coal gap. The types of plants that created coal, like the giant club mosses, were so thoroughly wiped out that the planet's engine of coal production just shut down. Imagine a world without deep, dense forests, a world where the primary producers of the ecosystem were gone. That was the world the survivors faced. And it was the same story in the oceans. The Great Permian reefs, those vibrant underwater cities, were gone. In their place was a reef gap that lasted for nearly 15 million years. The complex organisms that built those structures were extinct, and it took that long for a new type of creature, the modern corals we know today, to evolve and begin the slow, painstaking process of building reefs all over again. For the entire lifespan of 100 species, the oceans were missing their hearts. The planet's great engines of biodiversity, the reefs and the forests, had been turned off. The world was running on emergency power. The landscape of the early Triassic would have been a monotonous, almost alien sight. It was a hot, dry, and unstable world. The Siberian traps were still grumbling, occasionally belching out more lava and gas, keeping the climate in a state of chaotic flux. The plants that did survive were the pioneers, the weeds of the apocalypse. Hardy ferns, resilient seed plants, and strange quill-like lycopods covered the land in a low, scrubby carpet. There were no grand forests, just vast red-brown plains punctuated by patches of tough, scraggly vegetation. And roaming across these desolate plains was one animal, Lystrosaurus. The sheer abundance of this one creature tells the story of a broken ecosystem. In a healthy world, you have a complex pyramid of life. In the early Triassic, the pyramid had collapsed into a single squat pillar. The planet was no longer an intricate garden. It had become a planetary-scale weed patch, inhabited by a single, endlessly repeating species of pig lizard. But nature abhors a vacuum. And in the emptiness of the post-extinction world, an evolutionary opportunity of unprecedented scale had been created. The great synapsid dynasties were gone. Every major ecological niche, the large herbivore, the top predator, the medium-sized omnivore, was vacant. It was a blank slate, a chance for a new kind of life to make its mark. And the candidates for the new rulers of the world were once again the overlooked, the creatures that had survived in the shadows. They were the archosaurs, the ruling lizards. During the Permian, they had been small, agile, and marginal players, constantly outcompeted by the dominant synapsids. But they had survived the Great Dying, and they had a set of adaptations that made them perfectly suited for the harsh, broken world of the Triassic. They had a more efficient respiratory system, a huge advantage in the low oxygen atmosphere. They were better at conserving water, a critical skill on a hot, arid planet. And their unique, upright posture allowed them to move more efficiently than the sprawling reptiles of the past. While the world was in chaos, the archosaurs were quietly, patiently evolving. For millions of years, they remained small. But as the planet slowly began to heal, as the forests began to return and the rivers began to stabilize, the archosaurs began to diversify. They exploded into the empty roles left behind by the synapsids. Some became ferocious, crocodile-like predators in the rivers. Others grew larger, becoming the new dominant herbivores on the plains. And one group developed a particularly effective new design. They became fast, bipedal, and terrifyingly efficient hunters. They were the first dinosaurs. Around 230 million years ago, a full 20 million years after the Great Dying, these new creatures make their first quiet entrance onto the stage. They weren't the giants we think of today. Creatures like Eoraptor, the dawn plunderer, were no bigger than a large dog. They were nimble, quick, and probably hunted the small creatures that were now abundant in the recovering ecosystems. Their arrival wasn't a grand dramatic event. It was a quiet, opportunistic move by the children of the ashes. They were a new kind of life, born from the greatest catastrophe the world had ever seen and perfectly adapted to the world it had left behind. They were about to launch a dynasty that would last for 160 million years. But what about our own ancestors? What about the few synapsids that had survived alongside Lystrosaurus? Their story is one of quiet, patient endurance. They had survived the extinction, but they could not win the recovery. They were outcompeted at every turn by the rapidly evolving archosaurs. The dinosaurs and their relatives took over the day, so our ancestors did something remarkable. They adapted to the night. They became small, nocturnal, insect-eating creatures. They grew fur to keep warm in the cool of the dark. Their senses of hearing and smell became incredibly acute. Their brains began to process information in a new way, building a mental map of a world navigated by sound and scent instead of sight. For 150 million years, while the dinosaurs ruled the earth, our ancestors lived in their shadows. Our entire family, the great synapsid dynasty that had once been the undisputed kings of the world, had gone from owning the mansion to living in the basement. They were the creatures that scurried in the undergrowth, hiding from the titans that walked the earth. But they were surviving. They were waiting. They were holding onto the mammalian blueprint, refining it in the dark, passing it down through 100 million generations, waiting for another roll of the cosmic dice, another great extinction that would finally give them their chance to reclaim the throne. Life had returned. Not the same life that had been lost, but something new, something different, forged in the crucible of the apocalypse and shaped by the opportunities of a vacant world. The planet had healed its greatest wound, but the scar would remain forever, a permanent reminder etched into the rock, into the atmosphere, and into the DNA of every living thing that followed. A reminder that life can endure the unimaginable, and a warning, an echo across 252 million years, with a message meant directly for us. Here is the final part of our documentary. Part 10 of 10 Poe. Begin script. Part 10 of 10. Life had returned. Out of the ashes of the greatest catastrophe in Earth's history, a new world was born. The dinosaurs, children of the apocalypse, began their long march toward a reign that would last for 160 million years. In the shadows, our own tiny, fur-covered ancestors endured, carrying the legacy of the synapsids into a future they could never have imagined. The planet had healed its deepest wound, but the scar remained, a permanent lesson etched into the fossil record, into the chemistry of the rocks, and into the very DNA of the survivors. It is a lesson of unimaginable loss, but also of impossible resilience. And it is a warning, an echo across 252 million years with a message intended directly for us. Because the terrifying truth is, the story of the Permian extinction is not just a story about the past, it is a story about the present. The same forces that triggered the Great Dying, the same mechanisms that pushed the planet to the brink of annihilation, are at work again, right now, in the world around us. But this time, the catalyst isn't a volcano, it's us. We are living in the shadow of the Permian's ghost. Let's look at the evidence. The first killer of the Permian was a massive, sustained injection of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere from the Siberian traps, which caused runaway global warming. Today, in the space of just 200 years, human industrial activity, the burning of fossil fuels, has released hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, raising global temperatures at a rate faster than almost anything seen in the geological record. The Siberian traps were a natural geological event. We have become a geological force ourselves. We are the new supervolcano. The second killer was ocean acidification. The carbon dioxide from the eruptions dissolved into the seas, turning them corrosive and dissolving the shells of countless creatures. Today, our oceans are absorbing about a third of the CO2 we produce, and they are acidifying at an alarming rate. The great coral reefs of our own time, the vibrant hearts of our modern oceans, are bleaching and dying. They are suffering from the same chemical assault that destroyed the Great Permian reefs 252 million years ago. We are poisoning our own seas. The third killer was the collapse of ecosystems on land from deforestation and habitat loss. In the Permian, this was caused by acid rain and heat. Today, we do it with chainsaws and bulldozers. The fungal spike in the fossil record is the ultimate signature of a world where the forests have died. It is a stark warning about what happens when the green lungs of the planet are destroyed. The parallels are not perfect, but they are terrifyingly close. The Earth is sending out the same warning signs it did just before the Great Dying. But there is one profound, fundamental difference between then and now. The creatures of the Permian were innocent, unknowing victims. They had no idea what was happening to their world. The Gorgonopsian stalking the dying plains had no concept of atmospheric chemistry. The brachiopod struggling to build its shell in the souring ocean had no understanding of the carbon cycle. They were passengers on a planet that was driving itself off a cliff. We are not. We are the first species in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth to understand the mechanics of a mass extinction while it is happening. We are the first to be able to read the planet's history, to decipher the warnings written in the ancient rocks. The story of the Great Dying is not just a tragedy. It is a user manual for a planetary crisis. It is a gift of foresight, a message sent to us from the ghosts of a long-dead world. It tells us what happens when the systems that support life are pushed past their breaking point, and it also tells us what it takes to survive. The victors of the Permian apocalypse were not the biggest or the strongest. They were the most adaptable. They were the generalists, like Lystrosaurus, who could change their diet, change their behavior, and find ways to endure in a world where all the old rules were broken. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of all. Our survival is not guaranteed by our past dominance, but by our future flexibility. Our intelligence, our technology, our ability to cooperate on a global scale. These are the modern versions of the burrowing and generalist feeding that saved the few who remained. The question is whether we will use them. The recovery from the Great Dying is another stark lesson. The planet did heal, life did return, but it took more than 10 million years. 10 million years for the forests to regrow, for the reefs to rebuild, for the complex web of life to re-establish itself. The consequences of our actions today will not be felt for a season or a decade or a human lifetime. We are making decisions that will have geological consequences, shaping the future of life on this planet for a period of time that is almost beyond our ability to imagine. In the end, the story of the Permian extinction is the ultimate story of us. The iron in your blood was forged in the heart of a star, but the resilience in your DNA was forged in the fires of the Great Dying. Our own lineage, the synapsids, were nearly wiped out, reduced from the rulers of the world to small scurrying creatures of the night. But they held on, they survived. And that act of quiet, patient endurance, that refusal to vanish in the face of impossible odds, is the reason the dinosaurs didn't rule forever. It's the reason mammals got their chance. It is the reason you are here today, a conscious being, capable of looking back across this immense gulf of time and understanding the story of your own improbable existence. We are the children of the survivors. That is the true echo of the Permian. The story is not just a warning about fragility, it is a testament to the unbelievable strength of life itself. A reminder that even in the darkest hour on a planet that has become a waking nightmare, life finds a way. The great question of our time, the question that will define our legacy, is whether we have learned enough from the silence of that long-dead world to not repeat it. 252 million years ago, the planet fell silent. We are the first species who gets to choose if it will happen again. The story of life is one of survival. The next chapter is ours to write.